All right, Akshay, how are you doing, man? Thanks for coming on to the podcast.
Thanks so much for inviting me, David. It's great to be here.
Awesome. So, as we begin, right, for everyone, on listening, we just want you to kind of talk about what are you doing right now? What are you up to? I know you work with Converse now, so maybe let's start there. Tell us a little bit more about Converse now and what is your role at Converse now?
Well, Converse Now is a voice AI company that's been trying to solve the problems of the labor shortage in the food tech market. There's most quick service restaurants have been struggling to cover all the issues with the labor shortage in the market right after COVID. Companies have been struggling. People have been joining. Retention has been really low. Attrition has been high. Costs of training a new agent again and again every few months is pretty high. It mounts up, right? What we've been trying to solve is providing a consistent guest experience through voice AI, and then just the ability to take orders correctly and reduce that one small task, allowing the operators to focus more on the food quality and focus more on their work, which is probably what they're hired for, right? So that's what we're doing, and trying to use AI for all of that.
Oh, that's brilliant. And Converse now has been doing this AI stuff for almost 5 years now, right? It's a 5-year-old company.
That's right.
Yeah. So you guys must be really having a moment now, especially with the last, say, 8, 9 months, where everybody's now talking about AI, but you can say, well, we have been trying to talk about it for almost 5 years now. How does that feel
Yeah.
like?
Yeah, it's been a while. It's been a journey, David. I mean, for a long time, even even in the investor uh, area in the VC market as well, AI has been such a hot topic for a while now, right? And voice AI, ever since Siri came out, Samsung's competitors, Google Assistant, Bixby, all of these competitors came out. Voice AI was the buzzword, right? And people started putting it everywhere. I don't know if you remember, every app wanted to have its own voice AI bot and all that stuff. Even every banking application right now wants to have its own voice bot application and everything. But the complications of building something that was you know running so well through voice has been a challenge, right?
Right.
Alexa has been struggling. Almost everyone has been struggling, but the past 10 months, it has just drastically changed.
Yeah.
Everything has just become so much easier suddenly, right?
Hmm.
And the potential has just quadrupled, I guess, or even more than that. So
Yeah.
yeah, the past few
Well,
months
we
have
we
been
do
pretty
have to go
insane.
back and give credit to folks who have worked on transformative or transformation models that are focused on large language models, right? I think there
Right.
has been some amazing you know breakthroughs in the field, especially around those models, and that's why large language models kind of have taken a central space in pretty much everything. So I wanted to get into your role a little bit,
Mhm.
before we get into the solution itself that Converse now has. Tell us what your role currently is at Converse now.
So currently, I'm a senior engineering manager. I drive a bunch of different teams. I drive the platform team, and I'm also sort of I work as a floating architect across the organization in some sense. So I'm kind of working with several different teams. Driving products around how to integrate generative AI into different pieces of our architecture, or just rewiring the platform itself to provide a better experience, reducing latency, and so on and so forth. Several different challenges that we are trying to tackle across the company right now.
Got it. Yeah. And tell us how a young Akshay decided that this is what he wanted to do.
Yeah, so the story goes all the way back in 2018 when my my former manager from Samsung, where I used to previously work, he sort of reached out to me and he told me about Converse Now. He used to be the VP of engineering at our company. Only recently, he left us, but he reached out to me and he reached out to my other friend who was actually engineer number one at Converse Now. to sort of pitch this idea about using AI for improving CX, but make it specific to voice AI. And we had a history of working on voice AI with our prior experience of working at Samsung. So all of this kind of worked really well, and it the thing that really drove me into this decision was just the fact that it was such a fresh idea, right? And there was just so much possibilities. And one of the things that I was always sort of looking for was the autonomy to actually build something of my own, build my take my own decisions,
Yeah.
um, you know, and make my own mistakes, and have the autonomy to do that.
Right.
And that was just there, it was just handed over on a platter.
Right.
So that was the driving factor, to be honest.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you how and I was going to go in another direction, but I suddenly when you said that something came to how important do you think is the freedom to create important for developers when they're trying to build new solutions? Like, what do you think about that? Yeah.
I think it's massively important, right? Because
Right.
when you're starting off with something, you have, you may have some level of confidence that it's going to work out. If you have 100% confidence, it's probably not an exciting problem for you anymore, right? If it
Right.
is an exciting problem, you do not know if it's going to work, right? So there is that small, tiny rush that you have in your mind, whether can I do it like this or can I do it like that? And, you know, compared to a decade back, if you look at the world right now, there's at least 10 solutions, 10 SaaS solutions in the market for every possible thing, right? So the permutations and combinations of the tools that you could use, the languages that you could go for, the frameworks that you could select, it's just insane, right? So given an open-ended problem, how would you go about solving it? And what really, it's kind of like being in a grocery
Yeah.
store, and there's a fruit stall, and there's all kinds of fruits over there, and you get to select whatever you want,
Yeah.
right? There's
Yeah.
no
I think it's good time.
yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's a good time to be in tech right now, just because of the plethora or the amount of options that you have. I was speaking to one of the guests we had on our podcast was Christopher Stura, who's the director at PwC, and
Hmm.
he's got an amazing career going back to developing. So he was telling me like 20, 25 years ago, he actually wrote his own database because he didn't want to, he didn't there were like few options, and who whatever was available was like so expensive, like Oracle was expensive at the time, and he would write your own options. And then in the last say 15 years with open source technology and all of these different efforts that different people have put, there's so many options available now. So what I wanted to come back to from that was, I mean, it's a great time, but you as an engineer now, as an engineering manager, when you're building solution, how do you go about picking the right solution? Well, how does that process looks like for you at Converse now?
To be honest, this is one of the things I think, this is something that I'm dealing with right now, to be honest, right?
Okay.
There's just, like you said, there's just such a plethora of tools that's out there, right? And I have certain use cases where, in my opinion, it's probably a better idea to just build those tools yourself, invest in house, because of the slight complexity of those situations, or the customizability, or whatever, right? So there's two dimensions to this. Either you can let your product define the tool, or you can let the tool define the product, right?
Hmm.
So in cases where you are okay with the tool defining the product, you can definitely go for a tool that already exists out there, and you can potentially be limited by the abilities of that tool itself, and drive your product through that. And sometimes it's enough, right? Sometimes you don't need a lot, so it just works. But in a scaling company, in a growing company, you're always going to come across a situation where that tool is going to be a bottleneck,
Yeah.
and then you're going to be stuck, right? So being able to foresee into situations like that is, I think, what's important in making that decision of whether you should go in-house, put some investment in, build something that works exactly perfectly for your needs, and allows you to scale well, versus probably choosing something out from the open source market, or even like a SaaS tool, pay for it and then use it, and potentially you might get like limited by some functionality or the other.
So tell us a little bit more about from that point, right? Like the kind of
Mhm.
solution that you have. So from what I just understood from what you were saying, one of the things that you're solving, or the problem you're solving for the world, is that there's a shortage of people trying to take orders. So you have an AI based voice solution where somebody like me will call a restaurant and say, okay, I want to do something, and it can take
Mhm.
an order. I, on my end, as a user, will never understand that I'm interacting with an AI and I have given
Right.
this perfect order. Well, I've given a perfect order which has been taken perfectly and then has been
Mhm.
sent to the restaurant for it to be booked and delivered. Is that did I get that right?
That's exactly what it is, with one
Okay.
exception though. um, as much as we can try, it is almost close to impossible to like impersonate a real
Exact human.
human being, right? I mean, so it's quite obvious, like as a user, maybe for the few opening sentences you might be confused that you are potentially talking to
Right.
an actual human being who's just being unnecessarily formal right now. But after like a few iterations, you definitely know that you're speaking to AI and that you're speaking to a system, right?
Got it.
um and there's a very funny thing over there, that the moment people realize that they're talking to a system, they start behaving differently. Like
Yes.
you'll be very cautious about what you're saying, or you'll be very calculated about your decisions over there. And that's counterintuitive to sort of like what AI is trying to solve, right? What AI
Right.
is trying to solve and what we are trying to solve, and definitely using LLMs, is that you should be able to speak the way you are with humans, and the system should still be able to understand what you're saying, right? Instead
Right.
of the system having to guide you through this like very complicated set of questions, which makes you feel like you're in a Google form or something, right? Just
Yeah.
running through voice though.
Yeah.
So
And
yeah.
and so what you were saying, I mean, there are two problems, right? Like one is the fact that there is a bias that immediately comes into anybody's head because we are so used to speaking to normal human beings, and there is an interactive flow, and there is different emphasis that we put on different words, and there is accents and things like that. So it's natural for us to like feel like we prefer talking to a human being than talking to an
Right.
AI, right? There is this, but the second thing I was thinking about was the problem you're trying to solve. There are two problems, right? One is you have to make the AI sound like a human being,
Hmm.
and the second one is the conversation itself should feel like a natural human conversation,
Conversation.
right? So these are
Yes.
two. Um, so what does Converse now do? Like, are you tackling both of these problems in your solution?
So two things, like I think the first problem, the problem of trying to sound like a human, is something that we do not necessarily focus a lot on. um, Primarily because like the customers almost always figure out that they are speaking to an AI, and their primary focus is to get their order right. At the end of the
Exactly.
day, like they just care about getting the order right. So our primary focus is to get the conversation experience, the dialogue itself, as natural as possible, right? And the reason you need that to be as natural as possible is because if our system has truly understood the customer well, the system also needs to convey that back in a
Yeah.
natural enough way, right? We've had past experiences where system understands the user perfectly, but just because we are not able to convey that small bit of information, that yes, I got what you said correctly,
Yeah.
back, the user gets further confused and they're like, I'm not sure what to do anymore, and they like just disconnect and cut the call.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of like psychological and behavioral things that factor into like how to bring about a natural conversation. And it's not just AI, and there's a lot of like other pieces that come into the factor as well.
Yeah.
But it's
I
a
think
very interesting challenge there.
yeah, I mean, it's an interesting problem because I say something, there has to be speech to text happening, and then that text has to be composed and understood. Where I feel like large language model definitely helps in coming back with a
Yes.
response. So I get that, and then that needs to be converted into text to speech back. So it's a lot of real time processing that you guys are doing.
Exactly, exactly. And there's a bunch of like further complications out there with like the way people speak. uh
Yeah.
for instance, if you go to a drive through, you're looking at a menu and you're trying to order, right? So you're trying to think what you want to order, and you're trying to speak at the same time, so you're going to take these gaps. Sometimes you're going to, like, just go
Right.
and, like, hold on for, like, 5 seconds or something like that. So the system needs to be fast enough,
Yeah.
and the system also needs to wait when it needs to wait, right? So there's
Right.
an implicit understanding that a human mind has, that I need to wait. And the human mind can immediately say when it's like, when you're done speaking, even though you have taken like these massive breaks in between. But for a system to be able to determine that and understand that is quite complicated. And, like,
Yeah.
we have had to build, like, in-house models, contextual models. We've had to use NLP just to identify where to take a break, right?
Right.
When to understand that you're actually done speaking.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
I
quite
think
a
that
lot of,
those
like,
are the
these small
actual engineering
problems.
problems. And the reason why I can
Exactly.
relate with this so much is like when I took like I went and did data science and analytics for 2 years. I took a break, and one of my final projects that I worked on was I was trying to figure out. And there was this big rumor that Siri is always listening to you, and Amazon's
Yeah.
well, Alexa is always listening to you, and then Amazon's always listening. And and I was like, is this true or not? So I took that question as one of the projects that I did towards the end. And I used like a Python speech to text library with Google. And I realized that for whenever you have to do a prompt, right, say, hey, Alexa or Alexa, it's constantly needs to listen to that queue. So it is
Yeah.
listening. However, does that call go all the way to the API and get stored? That's a different question altogether. So and this similar problem, it's a very complex problem to solve. How do you engineer that wait time and to be always listening, right? Like I'm in my bedroom and I say Alexa, and my Alexa in kitchen kind of is has heard it. So it is going through like a loop trying to listen for the prompt, which is an interesting problem. And that problem you have taken into the solution at Converse now, which is a really interesting engineering problem. And then you also have to consider what the accent or the way that is pronounced back, right? So do you have
Right.
your own in-house solution for that, or are you using any API or an external third-party solution for that?
We have a bunch of different solutions that we sort of consider together, because no one solution works perfectly.
Right.
There's, again, like, for speech to text, for instance, right? There are several different problems. One of the biggest problems is that when you're making a phone call, the audio is going through PSTN, which is, like, the phone network, ultra low bandwidth. So that's like 8 kilohertz audio,
Yeah.
which is generally not good enough for, like, transcriptions. All these new services that keep coming out, all of them have solved, like, transcriptions for, like, 16 kilohertz really well. OpenAI Whisper works amazingly well for 16 kilohertz. Might not necessarily work really great for
4.8
8 kilohertz,
kilohertz,
right?
yeah.
Yeah. So there's a lot of challenges over there, where you have to go in house sometimes, build some custom solutions, then add other issues to that, because when someone's making an order, they're probably asking someone else that, hey, what do you want, right? So
Yeah.
there's, like, crosstalk happening over there. There's background noise. Someone's probably playing TV over there, or they're in the car and there's this engine noise humming. And the expectation over here is that the system's always going to understand what's happening, because the human mind can, right? So uh, there's a bunch of different problems that we have, which we try to, like, solve through different
Yeah.
solutions. There's external services that allow us to, like, differentiate speaker IDs, right? So we can identify there are two different speakers over here. We have in-house models that allow us to, like, provide additional accuracy. For instance, we use contextual models to and LLMs, to sort of, like, identify if we misheard something, and, like, in this context, what we've heard, the phonemes that we've heard probably, like, meant something else instead.
Right.
Several different solutions that we try to, like, make sure that the prediction at the end of all of this is potentially as accurate as possible.
I think your solution, when I was checking it online, is pretty great actually. Just the amount of engineering effort and the real time processing that you have to consider. And again, what you just shared is a big problem, right? 8 kilohertz audio.
It is.
That, and again, you are a musician, and we were talking about this when we
Yeah.
first met. You understand what an 8 kilohertz
Yeah,
sound looks like, and 16. And then if you are somebody who've done production, you know how much you have to do de-essing. You have to remove hums, and then you have to amplify the sound
exactly.
sometimes. Yeah, and but there are certain people who have solved that problem for you, so you are trying to use their solution. But again, all of
Right.
this has to happen real time, which is a big engineering problem to solve. So this is awesome. It's great to know how you are looking at the problem. Have you looked at 11 Labs by any chance? Like, it is a
We have.
project,
We have.
pretty dangerous project in my opinion, but
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
very interesting.
No,
What do you
we have integrated with 11 Labs, and we've
you
integrated
have?
with a
Okay,
bunch of other, similar competitors. I don't know if you've heard of Rhyme.ai.
I
They're
have.
pretty
Yeah,
good as well. Yeah.
yeah,
So again, same thing. The 8 kilohertz thing also applies back when you're converting text to speech, right? So
yeah,
11 Labs audios, Rhyme AI audios, like, you convert them to, like, the normal conversions happen at 44 kilohertz. They sound brilliant. They sound amazing, right?
yeah.
I downsample that to 16 kilohertz, still acceptable, still sounds pretty good. Downsample that to 8 kilohertz, it is not the same anymore, right? So basically,
Not
when
same.
you're
Yeah,
listening that same person back on the phone, uh, it does sound a bit robotic.
yeah,
The accents are there, the fluctuations are there, all of that's there, but like it does sound a little bit robotic.
yeah,
But it's still like, what they've done is brilliant. What they've done is like, amazing. But doing all of this kind of makes me realize, remember, every time you call up a bank or you call up, like, one of those, like, IVR systems, and it feels like, why is this audio such bad quality?
yeah.
Now I know why.
Right, right, right. I think now we have lots of respect for people who have built those systems too. When you're trying to build a
Right.
more AI based replacement for that, right?
Mhm.
Um, I think I use 11 Labs. I actually pay for it for some of my fun personal stuff that I'm doing, and I looked at the project and felt like the audio translation that I'm getting is the closest for at least 44 hertz
Yeah,
kilohertz quality. It's pretty good. I mean, there were times when I literally felt like, man, that sounds like me.
yeah,
It even caught my Indian accent in and tried to do a pretty decent job. But again, with what you said, if you downsample that to 8 kilohertz, 8 kilohertz, it's going to lose some of that voice, and it's going to add some noise, which does affect it. So it's again an interesting
yeah.
problem. So it's good to know that you're using all these solutions in your problem. So
We do, and we actually, like, from both sides, we sort of work with Google as well. We're in their beta program, so we keep experimenting with, like, all the latest models that keep coming out. Um, you know, we're sort of like, working a lot with Conformer CTC and Whispers models as well. We've been trying out a lot of different things. Each has their own problems. Some have
yeah,
problems with deployment, some have problems with training.
yeah,
Some require more training data than the other, but, like, they perform better. So there's pros and cons to all of these models, and, like, just putting in the effort to identify which one would probably work the best is. And sometimes you'll realize that, like, you'll put in a lot of effort to build an in-house model, and it only performs so much better than, like,
yeah.
out there in the market ready model.
Right.
And such disappointing news just breaks your heart, but you still have to try and
Yeah,
do
I
the
know.
best.
Yeah, I mean, I think we always want like our solution to have 5% significance error, but it
Exactly, yeah.
never really happens.
Yeah,
And you put in whatever data training data set you want to do, and then the test set can be however it needs to be. But then when you finally look at the results, you just feel like you haven't gained. But I do feel like the way you were just talking about how you're leveraging different solutions that are already there for your overall product. I think definitely there has been a lot of effort that you would technically would have to do on your own, now
yeah,
getting rid of because OpenAI has brought a great solution, or
yeah.
11 Labs has a the only solution that I struggle with 11 Labs personally is a cloning one, where you can
Uh-huh.
actually clone your voice, and you're like, so I have been ethically talking about in ethic forums about how there needs to be some sort of a classifier, and I think they released a classifier recently where you can upload an audio and check for authenticity if they're product use. It's interesting. There's still a beta though.
Yeah, even I mean, I don't know if you know about that, but OpenAI's own attempts at building a classifier for identifying whether a given response. This is for the LLMs for identifying whether a given response is a generated response versus an actual text, and they had to close that project down because
Yeah,
it's such a difficult problem to solve. Right? Audio is still, potentially an easier problem because there's going to be like some artificial nature to that audio which can potentially be detected.
right.
But on the text level, it is such a massive challenge, right?
It is a challenge, yeah. On text level, is challenge. I think I tested out a voice, classifier that 11 Labs released recently.
Hmm.
I think
Hmm.
about 4 or 5 weeks ago, and I
Yeah.
cloned a voice that I was testing, and then I put it in there, and I think it was able to detect that it was a. So I was like glad that they detected it properly. I didn't do
That's
extensive
actually
testing. Yeah,
no, but that's such insane strategy by 11 Labs,
yeah.
to build a tool that can break the world, but also provide a weapon to like handle that.
Exactly.
So that's
I mean, I
actually
think all AI companies have to come up with a way to
exactly
talk about how they are securing, and I think it has to be done. But the solution that you have with Converse now, right? Like what we talked about just now for the last 10 minutes is the problem itself that you're solving and the front end side of that problem. But you also have to consider, okay, this is a disparate problem where you're like, okay, I have a voice, one comes, you test it. Now you have to put this into production and have run for multiple different voices, different people coming and talking. So you have to consider scale and all of this in real time. So let's talk
right.
about the backend a little bit. How do you start going designing all of that for your problems?
um you know Again, designing this has been a learning process for us, right? Like we started off, some of my earlier learnings from from my earlier companies was that like immediately um, go containers, like again, like back in 2018, like that was the thing, just two
Yeah,
containers for everything possible, right? And I knew back then that like you had to get into Kubernetes. Like it was still something that companies were struggling with, or like not really struggling with, but like companies still were thinking, is it really necessary? Is it going to be overkill? Do I really need an orchestrator? A lot of big companies would do it, but like smaller companies would definitely consider if it is worth the effort, right? But a few tough decisions we took, early on, was that we decided we'd look for the hardest solution out there, right? So we decided to spin up a proper method on Kubernetes. We designed our own software and we built our own systems. We basically built our system to work as an SRE by itself, right? So
yeah.
basically, our system would automatically spin up servers whenever required, make sure they're healthy, do smoke tests, do all that stuff. And if for whatever instance a server were to be deleted or closed or something, it would immediately build it back up, right?
Wow.
So auto healing and all of that stuff, we try to embed that early on into early days itself. We had to build a custom operator and a lot of custom software and a lot of custom APIs and all, and almost everything was done in Golang. I was such a big fan of Golang, in the initial days itself,
I think
just
you
because
will
of
have a
the
lot of friends at Cockroach, because we
yeah.
built the entire, well, I would say CockroachDB or Cockroach Labs, because we
Yeah,
build the database with Golang as well. But yeah, sorry, I cut you off. You
right.
go ahead.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah, and the reason I got into Cockroach, and we eventually used Cockroach for Converse Now, was because I was so much into Golang.
yeah.
CockroachDB was one of the star Golang projects, and I was like, these guys are doing an insanely great job. And I had sort of played with Cockroach, self-hosted it in one of my hobby projects, and like I was really impressed with it, right? So I decided to like actually use it for our company as well. And early on days we had the self-hosted hosted version of Cockroach running a bunch of the stuff. But all this hard work around, like, taking the difficult route during the early days paid off, because we scaled to up to almost 1,000 stores
Wow.
without needing to hire a new SRE at all. Like, it was just two SREs that could handle the entire scale, and
Yeah, wow.
absolutely had to do nothing at all. Obviously, like, there were places, bugs that we could handle, but it was something that you could add into the software, add it into the system, and the system would take care of the, like, of the servers. So it was a pretty like, interesting thing that I felt that we did, to tackle a different kind of solution, around scale.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's brilliant to know that you, from the very beginning, have been considering what can we do to make the system as efficient as is possible without the intervention of anybody, right? It kind of
Yeah,
goes with the ethos and the principles of your engineering practice, where let's use AI, let's use automation, and let's
yeah,
make the system to run as good as possible without us going and fixing it, right?
yeah.
So that's brilliant. So you're using Kubernetes. Are you like using GKE, or are you using
GKE.
EKS? Oh yeah, so because you're more
Yeah,
Google right now. Okay.
we're more Google right now.
Right. Okay. So you use GKE and you build these amazing practices for containers. At the data layer, you are using
Cockroach.
CockroachDB for some work, and
Yeah.
what and your the entire program you're using Golang for that.
Golang, and obviously you have to use Python for all the
Yeah.
ML.
Machine
So
learning stuff. Yeah.
obviously, yeah. So all the
Got it.
machine learning stuff definitely on Python, but we're primarily limited to these two tools at the moment.
Got it. Yeah. So what I'm curious to ask, because I don't use Golang personally. I have more JavaScript, Python. Those are my go-to
Your go-to
languages. But I,
languages.
yeah, yeah. So tell me why Golang is amazing.
All right. So I'll tell you. Initial days we did use Python for some of our projects,
Yeah.
and while that problem's solved right now, and, like, the same problem has been solved for JavaScript as well through TypeScript. But my one of my initial problems with both Python and with JavaScript was, like, just the lack of type safety,
Hmm.
right? And I myself made several mistakes, because your data type could be anything, absolutely, right? So the amount of checks you'd have to put in was counterintuitive in my opinion. I always felt like, those checks could be added, like, could be forced into the process, and if you were to force it into the process, there's no way you'd make mistakes that would, like, break a system in production. And Golang sort of, like, initially came up with all those concepts of simplicity, of, like, type safety, and obviously the performance of Golang code is also insanely great, right? Obviously there's, like, new JS runtimes. I don't know if
Right.
you've heard about Bun, which is pretty
I've heard of it.
recent.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Bun, people are saying that Bun has, like, equivalent performance to Golang at the moment, and, like, all of that's insane right now. But, like, back when we started, obviously, like, the primary reason people went for Golang was because of performance,
Performance. Yeah.
because of, yeah, because of being able to, like, deploy software very easily. It just builds a single executable, can be run anywhere, any operating system, makes it very easy. And the best part of all of it was the parallelism within Golang,
Right.
right? I don't know if you know about go routines, but, like, the use of go routines versus
Yeah.
threads versus, like, all that stuff.
I have used threads in Python, and I don't like it.
You don't
So
like it.
yeah, I didn't enjoy the way it queues and the way it threads. So I what you shared, similar perspective I've gotten from engineers at Cockroach Labs as well, and some people who like the fact that it's way more simple to program with Golang.
It
So
is.
yeah,
It is. I mean, I think it has the easiest, like, relative to Python, like, similar to Python, the learning curve is very easy. You could
Hmm.
get into the language today, and, within a week you'd be writing something significant. It's that
That's
easy.
brilliant. Well, yeah. So I'm gonna go check out Golang and start programming, and I'll say Akshay led me to it. Finally, he was the one who converted me. Man, that's awesome. So, you were talking about something that I feel is very important for folks to kind of understand. I mean, we work in tech, right? And um, there is no ultimate developer. Like, I've never met an ultimate developer. I have met some great architects, right, who understand and have the foresight and vision. But when it comes to development, there's no ultimate developer. There's no developer who hasn't made mistakes. So, talk
Yeah.
about a little bit more about, why is it important to make mistakes as a developer for building a great solution?
Yeah.
Might be a
I
little bit of
mean,
a abstract, wide question, but I think you have great developer experience, and I think that is something that I wanted to kind of bring out. So
I think being careless sometimes and being lazy is why engineers have come up with solutions to fix those problems, right? So if
right,
I were to never make mistakes, then I would never build a problem that someone else wouldn't have to solve. Like
right,
if we could all code on, like, pen and paper, or if we could all code on a notepad, then people would never have to come up with IDEs, and GitHub Copilot would never have been a thing, right? So it's inherently, the reason that we make mistakes, that other engineers come up with ways to solve those mistakes and make us, like, better developers in a sense.
right.
So it is quite important eventually to be as lazy as possible. Like, for example, the software that we built was, in some sense, a product of laziness. I just didn't want to wake up and look at if my
Yeah,
server
yeah,
was up and running, right?
right,
And you keep doing that across the system, automate as much as possible, and you aggregate all of that into this massive thing, which just which is a developer stream. So the
right.
best developer probably does the least amount of work. that's
That's what
that's
I've heard,
the
and I think
Yes.
that's true too. Yeah.
Yeah.
So now you went from being a developer with like great experience with machine learning, and now you're a senior manager leading. How big is your team now?
My team, I drive a bunch of different teams, but I drive almost approximately 17 people right now.
17. Yeah.
Yeah, across the organization. And it's not a massive team. It's a bunch of different small teams that I help drive, uh, primarily around data engineering, and the platform itself, the infrastructure, and, like, some efforts around, like, using LLMs in different parts of the system right now. There's obviously a more dedicated team that's working on solving problems around our inference itself, our
Right.
NLU, our core NLU, and, like, we're sort of, like, embedding whatever we can, learning from open GPT, open AI GPT models and all that stuff
Right.
into it. And surprisingly, I feel like we've been, like, quick to adapt this, because, like, our solutions are already using open AI models, and they're out in production right now.
Right.
And I don't directly work with those teams, but, like, like I said, I'm a floating architect, so I work with those guys a lot to kind of like steer the architect, you know uh,
Right.
and put that perspective for them. But, like, it's a lot of interesting work happening across all the teams, and, like, just it's a wild startup energy, if I put it right. It's just
Yeah. No,
like,
I can
it's a
understand.
lot of
Yeah.
people running in a lot of different directions.
Yeah. So how has the transition been for you from being a developer to now being in a position where you guide the team into making the right decisions? Or how has that been for you? Like, do you enjoy that process?
In my opinion, it has been one of the hardest transitions for me, right? Because I've always been a doer, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
For 2 consecutive years, my managers gave me one feedback, that you've got to stop doing and you've got to start letting people do stuff, right? So obviously, initially, like, I built most of the stuff. Then I started having, like, people in my team. They used to do work. They used to, like, I used to give them tasks, but, like, sometimes I would, like, inherently end up finishing their tasks for them,
Right.
because I grew impatient sometimes, and, like, I got a lot of sort of, like, negative feedback, and it was a hard learning for me, to be honest. But, like,
Yeah.
at this moment, like, I've successfully sort of, like, realized this enough through mistakes. And it's a journey, I think, to be able to, like, hold back and say that no, this is something that you have to understand, you have to go through. I can show you,
Yeah.
I can guide you, I can give you hints, or I can just, maybe I'll just ask questions, right?
Yeah.
With
Yeah.
some of my engineers, I'll just go and ask questions, and I'll be like, why did you do this? Why did you decide to do this? Was there a reason? And sometimes just that questioning itself drives the thinking and allows the
Right.
developer to understand, like, maybe
Yeah.
there's another approach to this,
Yeah.
which
I
is
mean, which is
exactly what you
good.
want.
Yeah, which is good because I think it's part of growth, right? And
Right.
I have done similar things where I have a tendency to things that I'm really passionate about or projects that I started that I want
Hmm.
to see succeed, right? And then
Hmm.
I mean it's just natural for us to like jump in and try to save whatever wrong direction somebody might be going in. But at the same time, I feel like from it's a transition from becoming a developer to a manager, and then from realizing that you're not really a manager but a mentor to your team,
Exactly.
or just a post that they can come and have a great conversation with. So I'm glad that there is this perspective that all of us young engineers and developers have kind of grown into now, which
Yeah.
is brilliant. Yeah. So talk to me about one thing that I was always curious about: the solution that you have with Converse now doesn't
Hmm.
really have to sit and get applied within just the the food or the restaurant industry, right? You can apply that use case within banking or say insurance when somebody calls for a claim. Have you considered or have these conversations come up where you are like, well, this is not really domain specific, but the problem and the training set is going to change obviously because
Right.
the conversation is so different. So what leads to looking at the problem differently when it changes domains?
So interesting thing over there was that we were open domain when we started off.
Right.
When our company started, it was not specific to food tech. We only
Right.
pivoted to be specific to food tech, I think, 6 months or 8 months into our journey. And the reason we did that, because it's difficult to build a generic system in AI. Um, Having a niche makes it easier to solve that problem well, and build a solution that can scale well. If we were to go multi-domain, it becomes potentially more difficult to scale. I think fintech, we have competitors, not in food tech, but in conversational AI in general. There are
Yeah.
competitors who focus more on, like, customer service and fintech, and several other domains. But I think it works for them because their knowledge base uh, works the same. Like, most of
Right.
those systems have a very similar looking knowledge base, right? So any conversational AI system would require a knowledge base, from which to extract the information, give it back. As long as we have a similar looking knowledge base, which could be, which used to be graph databases before.
Right.
Now, with LLMs, like, it's going to be like just, a text file could be your knowledge base, and you can still get it all
Right.
work. um, the problem with food tech specifically was that the knowledge base is coming from another API, which is a POS system of its own, right? Like,
Right.
a point of sale system has its own menu, has its own database. Like, you have such massive companies um, that are building these restaurant menus within their systems.
Right.
Uh, the reason food tech was such a good area for us was because food tech is such a difficult area
It's
for
an
the
interesting different. Yeah.
yeah, the barrier of entry is definitely higher.
Yeah.
Anyone with a good conversational AI could potentially solve the kind of things that we're probably trying to solve as well. But
Yeah.
the actual barrier to entry is to be able to, like, integrate with these point of sale systems and build that knowledge base out of a real live running menu, right?
Right.
Because you could be ordering something, and they could, like, run out of, like, olives, for instance, and your system has to be immediately be able to say that, sorry,
Yeah.
we don't have olives anymore. So
Right. Right. Right.
stuff like that makes it, interesting, increases the complexity of the problem, but also, like, allows us to then do really well within that one domain.
Got it. So does Converse now? So I didn't think about this until you said it. So you are also real time getting feedback from the restaurant on what's available and what's
Yes.
not available, and that's something that you have to consider as well when the AI.
Yes,
So you have to train that piece as well, or like consider that at least. Wow,
exactly. So
interesting.
there's a lot of pieces. So one of the craziest pieces of solutions that we had to build internally was that we had to build an integration system that integrates with all these different POS vendors and brings in their data into one centralized format, which then
Yeah,
becomes our knowledge base, which then becomes
right.
like a live running database for us. And that allows our system to, our system, when our system says identifies a certain order, right? And identifying the order itself is such a massive deal. There's people ordering crazy combinations. You've seen
Yeah,
how Starbucks orders can be, right?
yeah.
There's people ordering pizzas with, half cheese and half pepperoni, and just insanely complicated combinations,
Right,
right?
right, right, right,
So being able to identify that, then being able to, convert that into what the POS expects,
right.
this translation is insanely difficult. And again,
Exactly.
like hooking up all the live changes makes it an even more difficult problem.
And then
So
you also have to consider consistency in your data, right?
exactly.
Because if somebody misses out olives, they said they need olives and you said, yeah, well, we'll give you olives, but if that's
Right.
not there in the database, it's not consistent, you gave the wrong order, and that can affect customer experience.
One of the, mentalities that we kind of try to have is to focus on customer experience first, and then everything after, right? So it we are okay with having a worse accuracy, but
Right.
we are not okay with having a bad customer experience.
Customer experience, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think which is critical. um and you also have to make sure that all of this happens with like low latency, right?
exactly.
So when you now have scaled to like thousands of restaurants and stores, and you have to also work with all of these different POS systems, which are each different, owned by different companies,
Yeah.
and you have to centralize all of that, you are looking at a really massive. And now I get the scale of the problem a little bit
Right.
more, just the way you described it. And it's a very interesting problem that you're solving. Talk about how you look at latency in terms of deployments, right? So all these thousand restaurants are not really in just one part of the region. You have to deploy these in EKS across multiple regions. Like, do you have to then how do you handle all of that?
Yeah, so one of the ways we handle that is, like I mentioned you, what we sort of do to allow each of these customers to have their own fine-grained solutions sometimes. And like I
Yeah.
said, each customer has their own menus, so they also need to have their own custom, twists to their solutions.
Hmm.
Every customer, every system, every restaurant would probably want to speak out their name in a different way, or
Yeah.
provide their upsells in a slightly different manner, so on and so forth, right? So our system eventually has been built in a pseudo multi-tenant way, where we end up spinning up small clusters of microservers for
Nice.
each identifiable customer, right? And then that's where Kubernetes really comes to the picture.
Right. Right.
And the pods within our cluster, scale up massively, and then you embed coding principles, you embed HPA into all of them, and you have an operator that's orchestrating all of that. And you make sure you have proper resource budgeting allocated, right? So we have a very smart mechanism to automatically assign the right amount of memory and CPU and resources, based on what kind of traffic that server's going to expect now,
Right.
right? And then you add on HPA on top of that, that allows you to really handle peak load and peak peak volumes really well. But at the same time, we got to then think about costs. So then we got to make a system that can shrink down when there's nothing happening, and
Very
really
good. Yeah.
expand up massively when everything's happening. And one of our biggest challenges is, for instance, Super Bowl weekend. Super Bowl weekend, everyone's making orders, right? Everyone's
Yes.
calling in and making orders. we almost always run out of capacity in terms of our agents, because our system also has, like, some agents, as a fallback mechanism when our system is, like I said, customer experience eventually trumps all. So if AI is absolutely not able to take that order, it does fall back to an actual human being, right?
Right.
um, and Super Bowl weekend, we almost always hit the limit. We almost
Yeah.
always hit the limit. But the system survives. The system
Yeah.
never breaks apart. So
Yeah.
that's actually, and it's really great to see that happen. Like, being able to see that volume really grow up. Your systems, like, just somehow manage to handle all that traffic.
Survive
So
all of
many.
that. Yeah. And
Exactly.
I've worked with many companies in the past with we've had where I've heard and had these Super Bowl level conversation where
Hmm.
uh, technology kind of makes or gets broken breaks for a company or a use case on Super Bowl weekend. Like I've heard lots of people who've had bad Super Bowl experience and they've said, we're going to change our database. We're going to move from this database or to now this
Uh-huh.
database. We're going to stop using VMs. We're going to move to Kubernetes. We're going to orchestrate the whole thing. And the great thing that I've really enjoyed listening to you and that's insightful is the way you've built everything for scale from 4 years ago to have the vision that this is where the industry is going to go and we will need to scale for Super Bowl events and having that foresight and building that into your system has been brilliant to know about. Tell me about, and I know we are getting close to the end of our conversation today, and I just
Yeah.
look at this as part of conversation one, part two,
Yeah.
part three. We'll keep doing, but what I wanted to understand was we spoke so much about AI in the beginning, and we are
Mhm.
talking about how it's been helpful. I want to get your insights on where do you think it's going. Where do you think Converse now is gonna take AI and go in the future for your users?
Right. I mean, like, speaking, like, AI has been there for a while now, right? And people have been using it in such different ways. Um, Specifically speaking about generative AI, which has been, like, blowing up right now, is it, like, one of the things that I like to tell people is that it is one of the biggest tools that we have been given right now. But it's not a magic pill, and that's the thing that, like, really, that's the fine line, that's the fine print, that it's an amazing thing, but it's not a magic pill. So being able to use it in the right places and in the right ways is what really will distinguish one company from the next, and that's what we're trying to do right now. Is that we're trying to really focus on is to find problems that really require a solution using LLMs potentially, right? So
Right.
you got to stop looking at pieces of your software architecture which are already working really well, right? I wouldn't push an LLM into my database. Why would I do that?
Mm.
I wouldn't do that
Yeah.
because my database works really well, right? So where would I put LLMs in? I would put an LLM in a part of system where algorithms are not cutting it out, right? So I'll try
Yeah.
to put in a model to do some of that work. I'll try to, build some data around it. I'll try to put in, generative AI, or, like, a model to fix something where I have massive amounts of data already, or I have the ability to curate some data. And fun fact with LLMs is that you don't even need so much data. Like, a few thousand example cases is generally always
Now
enough
it's
to
good
fine tune
enough.
it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Now it's good enough to your fine tune your model, right? um, and, like, as long as you're able to build that data, you can actually even have a model ready and see if it is, like, comparative in performance. And just, like, I'll for instance, I'll give you a for instance. Within our system, there is a small piece of code which we had written that summarizes your order, right? So you've just added, like, a bunch of different things to your order. You added a pizza, you added, like, a chocolava cake, you added, like, some crazy customizations to your pizza, half and half and all that, like, crazy stuff. And you've probably added, like, wings, and it's like, it's a combination of, I've got 6 of one flavor, 8 of some other flavor, and, like, 20 of the remaining, and all of that. um,
Probably looks sounds like my order actually, but
but you get what I mean, right?
yeah.
When you are to summarize that order, it becomes long and tedious, And with orders like this, there's a lot of grammar involved, right? So
Yeah.
when you're talking about size, it has to come before it becomes an adjective, right? But then, like, the numbers come afterwards. And there are some things which are special instructions which are said in a different way. Like, let's say you want your wings well done, right? So I'm not going to say that I've added well done for your wings or something like that. That
Yeah. Yeah.
those small mechanical things which algorithms, or like, traditional
I mean,
algorithms generally end up doing.
yeah, yeah. I mean, that's also that's a difficult prompt problem too, right? Like, I mean, if you ask
Exactly.
ChatGPT, or like, I mean, I've seen differences between 3.5 and version 4, where at the same prompt, I can tweak it four different ways, and the result is different.
Yeah.
And so you have to really fine tune and kind of
Fine tune.
have places. So you're not making this solution easy, Akshay. You are just bringing ways to show how cleverly you have built this solution. So a
Yeah.
lot of credit to you and your team. I think one thing that should help you in the summary is um, the OpenAI increasing the token limit.
Yeah,
so
it
so
did. So
yeah.
we actually solved this. We actually figured out a smart way to, and I'll not disclose it, but
Yeah, don't do
we
no, don't do it.
yeah, we actually figured out a smart way to tweak our prompt, and, like, run the summary through OpenAI. We tested OpenAI. We tested out even the Palm 2 models from Google, and
Right.
interestingly, Palm 2 models managed to do pretty well at
Yeah.
fractional costs, and almost negative, like, zero latency. So
I
we
think it'll
actually
come down to cost. Yeah. I think the way
yeah.
it's going now, and I used the latest, I used Bard a few days ago after the
Mhm.
latest updates. And I have to say that the results I got from Bard for a similar prompt on GPT-4, 4 months after Bard is released, looks so much better than ChatGPT. Although I feel GPT-4 is still
The best,
a little
yeah.
bit ahead.
Yeah.
I think I don't know if you're checking out Cloud 2 or Claude
Yeah.
2 by
Claude is
Anthropic. Yeah,
actually right now, I think, Claude's feature sets, just its multimodal feature sets, being able to, like, browse the internet, being able to, like, dump in, like, documents and doing all that stuff, is, like, is what sets it apart. So for me,
yeah,
uh, personally, like, I use Claude for, like, more analytical stuff where I need, like, some document analyzed and stuff like that. I
right.
used OpenAI for, like, more mechanical stuff where prompts are, like, there's more
Yeah,
semantic understanding to be met. And if everything's easy, I go for Palm 2, where, like, all I want is, like, lower costs and lower latency and stuff like that.
yeah. Now this is going to be interesting, like, and to see. And I'm also kind of curious to see how it all shapes up. You can go with one model, or
Mhm.
you can have a multi LLM model kind of solution,
Yeah.
which I feel will be more cost effective at some point. Will also bring competition within different companies who are trying to sell LLM, because it's a lot of amount that OpenAI is going to charge you for all the cost that you have with
Exactly,
OpenAI.
exactly.
Yeah,
Because of the tokens and because of the frequency, right? And as our system scales, like, for something like our system, a solution like this goes in the micro scale, right? So there's, like, so many small pieces where this is going to be called from. And, like, a cent's difference can make such a
it's a lot.
massive billing difference. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah,
No, I
it
mean,
all
it's
makes a
great. It's
difference.
it's. I mean, this is since I've started doing the podcast. I mean, I've wanted to talk to somebody with, like, who's solving a real AI problem.
Mhm.
And I've had great pleasure talking to different people who are building amazing systems. But I was particularly excited about our conversation, and I'm really glad that we went into the details of some of the things that you're solving without spilling the secret sauce. But I'm, like, really excited for what you guys at Converse now are doing. So here's one of the last question I typically ask, because I feel like there are a lot of developers, engineers who are looking at solving problems, and of course are considering AI. What is your advice on sources and places where they should go and lean in on, as you kind of close out the podcast?
Okay. All right. This is quite interesting because, for me personally, I think there's been, like, two or three primary ways where I sort of like, keep myself up to date in some ways. I mean, like, the first one, without a doubt, and almost every developer does this, is Hacker News, right?
Yeah,
Hacker News eventually like gives you, at least channels you towards the right type of trends that you should be following and you should be keeping yourself up to date with. The second thing, ironically, is Twitter. And like, I just feel so conflicted saying that. But like, for me, at least personally, following the
yeah,
right kind of people, following the right academicians, and like, following more legit sources on Twitter has
right,
been academically very giving, because like, I always get exposed to interesting insights about like, existing papers. For instance, when the transformer paper first came out, like everyone was so active about it, discussing about it openly on Twitter, and their opinions allowed me to think in different ways, in ways which I would have probably never thought by myself about it, right?
I agree.
Interesting thing, I don't know if you read about the superconductor paper hype, which just came out recently.
No, I
uh,
haven't
so
read.
um,
Send it to
okay,
me.
okay.
Send it to me after the after the,
Yeah,
the
I'll send
discussion.
it.
Yeah,
But like, it's pretty crazy. So these are the two ways I generally keep myself up to date.
yeah,
um and this is like, just a gateway to like, go into better sources. This like, most of these posts allow me to find actual blog posts or substacks which have like, consistently been putting out like, insanely good articles. And then I
right.
then like, eventually go bookmark those and like, drive those in my own way.
Oh, that's
But
brilliant. Yeah. No, that's brilliant. The off late, and I
mhm.
haven't seen this. I haven't heard this often from people, but many people I've spoken to recently have been telling me that how reading papers is significant now. Also, now
Yeah,
you also have the help of Claude 2 or
exactly,
GPT-4, where you can just put a paper in and it can summarize and make it readable to you, and you makes it more human to relate
exactly.
with the paper. But I think never before have we seen this level of information getting digested so easily before, and now then also getting applied in the field quickly, because sometimes you would have papers getting released 15 years ago that would get applied when they felt the time was right or this made
Exactly.
sense. But
Yeah,
now a paper gets applied in production way quicker than it used to be before. So it's
that's
we are
true.
living in fascinating times.
It's insane right now.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to say, as we close, Akshay, you have been awesome. I mean, and I'm really, really glad that we could talk about what you guys are working with, Converse now on, and super excited for you guys to scale from 1,000 restaurants to 10,000, then to 100,000 and to a million restaurants or stores. Uh, you know, and we'll be here to talk about it in part two. What do you say?
Awesome. It's been a pleasure, David. Like, I mean, like, our earlier conversations as well. It's always been such a pleasure to talk to you. And yeah, let's hope for the best. I mean, like, we're trying our best to like, serve our product to as many people as possible. Market stuff, we'll give it a shot. Let's see what happens.
Yeah,
We'll
I mean,
definitely try our
I
best.
think the market's swinging in the right direction now,
Yeah.
slowly. Yeah, but
Mhm.
surely, right? And again, thank you so much for hopping on, and everyone, go follow Akshay. As you said, Akshay, people can follow you on LinkedIn. Is
LinkedIn,
that one of the
yes.
okay? Wait, do you write your own Substacks or engineering blogs or anything that you want to share with people as well?
Um, right now, not necessarily. Not. I don't really get the time to like, add as many blog articles as I would like to, but hopefully soon.
Yeah,
And hopefully a bunch of blogs around like, some of our internal tech as well, which we'd like to release from our company blog sites itself.
very
And
cool.
uh, probably post those on LinkedIn whenever I get the chance.
Awesome. For everyone following, if for the time being, while Akshay puts up those blogs, go follow Converse now. I think they have amazing content coming out. But again, thank you, Akshay, for hopping on the podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Same here, David. Just been amazing this time.